So I wonder if you have seen this movie. It's called The Family Man. Came out in 2000, starring Nicolas Cage and Tia Leone. Raise your hand if you've seen The Family Man. All right, if you haven't, I recommend you see it. So it's this story of the main character. He's this high-powered Wall Street guy. He's got a penthouse apartment in Manhattan, and he has achieved everything you can achieve in life, wealth and power and fame, except he doesn't have real love. And it's one of those stories where it's kind of an interesting story. He wakes up in a different life. It's still him, but he's in an alternate reality of what his life would have been like had he actually married the woman that he was engaged to in college. And there he is. They're living in the suburbs. They've got a bunch of kids. He's working at his father-in-law's tire shop. And at first he's like, what's happening to me? And then throughout the course of the story, he realizes that this is the life that really has meaning. And just when he wants this life, boop, he wakes up alone in his penthouse apartment. But he has hope for a different kind of life. Now, if you haven't seen that one, you probably are familiar with at least one of these next two pictures. So the guy on the right is George Bailey. What's the name of that movie? It's a Wonderful Life. Watch it every Christmas. And then, of course, the Christmas Carol. The main character is Ebenezer Scrooge. And what all three of these stories have in common is that each of the main characters are given a glimpse of what life could be. And because of that glimpse, they are given hope for their journey. And so, I wonder about you today, about where you're at on your journey. Have you ever come to a point in your life where you really seriously question whether it's worth going on? Maybe you're there right now. Well, I hope that in the course of this story, as we unpack it, that you will find hope for your journey. Because that's how I think about this story today. It's the story we just heard from Mark chapter 8, verse 27 through chapter 9, verse 8. And it's usually called the story of the Transfiguration. But I think this story really gives us a glimpse of who Jesus truly is. So let's look at this picture again that we've seen over and over. And we've said that the Gospel of Mark is divided into two equal halves. And the first half is the green section of Epiphany, where everything is going great, and Jesus is this rock star, and people are flocking to him. And people come to him because they want to hear him teach. And they come to him because they want him to heal them. But I also think that they come to him because they want him to be their leader. They want him to lead them out of oppression from the Roman Empire, to set Israel free. And today's story is that turning point, right at the climax in the middle, where things change and they turn purple as we enter into this season of Lent. So today I want us to zoom in to the top of that mountain and look at this story called the Transfiguration. And we need to realize that the where of this story is just as important as the what of this story. This story takes place in a city called Caesarea Philippi. There's three things I want to point out about this place. First of all, it's named after Caesar. That's why it's Caesarea. Now, Caesar, remember, was the emperor of the Roman Empire. And you remember on the first week of our series in Mark, Pastor Mark told us that in those days when a message would come from the empire, the herald would come into the town and he would say, "Behold, the gospel of Caesar, the Son of God." Caesar, the most powerful man on earth. So it's named after Caesar, but it's also named after Philip, Caesarea Philippi. This is Philip II, also known as Philip the Tetrarch. And he was the son of Herod the Great. You probably recognize Herod the Great from the Christmas story. This is the Herod where the wise men came and said, "Show us where the King of the Jews has been born." And Herod went and slaughtered all of the children in the village of Bethlehem. Herod the Great. The king of Israel who was put on the throne as a puppet of the Roman Empire. But not only is it Caesar Philip, this town, but there's a third thing that's not evident in the text, but this town was also known as Peneus, which means the region of Pan, the Greek god Pan, who the Romans knew as Faunus. You probably would recognize him as that dude that's half goat, half man with the horns, playing the panpipe, hanging out with the naiads and dryads and nymphs, right? He was the god of the wild places, the god of nature, the god of fertility. And so this region, this Caesarea Philippi, is a place that is filled with all of these symbols of the power structures of the Roman Empire and the Greco-Roman religion. So you probably have noticed that Caesarea Philippi is not your typical Orthodox Jewish village. And if you look on the map, it's about as far away from Jerusalem, both geographically as well as theologically and politically, as you can get within Jewish territory. So I was wondering, what is the Caesarea Philippi of our day? I just think it would be an interesting thought experiment to think through. If Jesus were to have this story take place in our society today, what would be the location that he would choose that would be the symbol of all of the power structures and the significance that our society holds up? Could make for some interesting dinner conversation, or maybe during the breaks of the Super Bowl, you can talk about it. And if you want to join us in our online discussion group at Grace Learning Center, I'm sure it will be a great fodder for our online discussion. But we have to remember that this is the setting for this conversation that happens between Jesus and his disciples. He looks around at all of these symbols of Caesar and Philip and Pan, and he asks, "Who do people say that I am?" And his disciples are like, "Oh man, they're saying all kinds of things, Jesus. Some people think you're John the Baptist come back from the dead out to get Herod." You remember last week we learned about that? Herod thought that Jesus was coming to get him because he had decapitated John. And he said, "Well, other people think you're Elijah because Elijah was predicted to come back and present the coming of the Messiah. And then other people think that you're this great prophet," and all these different ideas. And then Jesus stops. And he looks his disciples in the eye and he says, "But who do you say that I am?" I think this is probably the most important question that has ever been asked in human history. And I think it would be worth pausing right now. And I invite you to imagine that if Jesus were standing right here in the flesh, just like I am standing here before you, and Jesus were to look you right in the eye and say, "Who do you say that I am?" How would you answer? I'm not going to ask you to turn to your neighbor and give your response, but I am going to invite us in the space of 2 deep breaths to seriously consider your response. Well, Peter pipes up like he always does, and he gives the correct Sunday school answer to the question. The NRSV says, "Jesus, you are the Messiah." And the Greek word there is Christos. And so Peter says, "Jesus, you are the Christ." Gold star, Peter. Remember the last time we heard the word Christ? It was in the very first line of this Gospel of Mark. It says, "The good news of the gospel of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God." Who do you think the Jews were expecting the Christ to be? You know, I think that what the Jews were really expecting was another guy like King David, a guy who would come and raise up an army and storm the temple and storm the palace and tear down those corrupt kings of Herod and put a godly king on the throne and then raise up this army and oust the Roman Empire once and for all and establish Israel in all of its glory. That's what they were expecting. But what about us? What do we expect from God? What is our expectation of the Messiah, of the Christ? You know, most people who flocked around Jesus during that green season of Epiphany, they came after Jesus to get something out of him. If they were hungry, they wanted him to feed them. If they were sick, they wanted to be healed. If they were oppressed, they wanted him to set them free. What do we want out of God? You know, sometimes I wonder if we actually know who the Christ is. Jesus responds to Peter's Sunday school answer, and he says, yes, Christ. There is that word again. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Let's read this verse together. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This is what the Christ looks like. Is that what your picture of a great leader is? See, that's the whole purpose of the Gospel of Mark. The story of Mark helps us understand what God's kind of power looks like in contrast to the power of Rome and to the power of the Herods. And this is why our theme for Lent is, who is the Christ? And Jesus will teach us throughout Lent, through his words and through his actions, what the Christ really is. That the power of God is to give up his life for the sake of the world. It is only in weakness that we are strong. It is only in dying that we can live. Now, if you were standing there that day, how would you respond to these words of Jesus? I think I'd be right there with Peter and be like, I don't think so, Jesus. No, it says that Peter rebuked Jesus. Not on my watch, not going to happen. And I love how Jesus responds to Peter. He says, get behind me, Satan. He called Peter Satan. What is that all about? Well, the word Satan means adversary. So technically, anything that is opposed to what God is doing is satanic. And I wrestle with Satan every day in my life, just like Peter. And my guess is just like you. And then Jesus speaks some of the harshest words that any of us could ever hear. He says, if you want to follow me, then you have to take this same path. You must deny yourself. You must take up your cross. And you must follow me to death and beyond. Would you really want to follow that? Honestly? You know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says that the gospel, that grace is free, but it is not cheap. You see, the gospel of God is a free gift. There is nothing that you can do to make God love you more. There's nothing that you can do to earn God's forgiveness. It's an unconditional promise, and that's the good news. But if you want to follow the ways of Jesus and actually make a difference in this world, then you must follow this path. There is no other way. I'd like to guess that the disciples were a little bit freaked out at this point in the story. Jesus' teachings just got real. And that's why Jesus takes Peter, James, and John to the top of the mountain. And there he is transfigured before them. And it says that his clothes shine brighter than any bleach could bleach them. And he's standing there next to Moses and Elijah, who are two of the greatest prophets and leaders of the people of Israel. And the disciples are freaking out. And then this dark cloud encompasses the mountaintop. And a voice comes from it. It's just like when Moses went up on the top of Mount Sinai to receive the law. And the voice says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." This happened once before, do you remember, in the story? When Jesus was baptized, it said that the sky was torn open and the voice said the same thing. Do you know why I think this happened in this story? It's to give the disciples a glimpse. See, Jesus had just asked them to do a horrifying thing, a dangerous and terrifying path. He was about to make his journey to Jerusalem, where he knew that he would die. See, this glimpse is just exactly what the disciples needed so that they would have hope for their journey. It's like Jesus was saying, guys, it's going to be worth it. I promise. And then as quickly as it came, poof, it's gone. Can you imagine? The disciples are like, and Jesus is up on the top like, whoop, just plain old Jesus, looking around like, well, that happened. Okay. All righty, guys. Let's go. And then he makes and starts the journey toward Jerusalem. And that's the journey that we're going to take for the next 7 weeks. As Jesus teaches us who is the Christ. So where are you right now? Are you tired and discouraged on your journey? Are you a little bit freaked out about the fact that Jesus wants you to follow him on this journey? Well, I want you to remember this, that each week when we come to worship, and why we come to worship, is that when we gather at this table around the body and the blood of Jesus, we get a glimpse of the kingdom of God. We get a glimpse of God's love and the power of forgiveness to change this world. And Jesus looks at us and he says, it is worth the journey. Amen.